Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Alex Nichol, and I'd like to welcome you to the ISS. This is the latest in a series of events within the ISS Defence and Military Analysis Programme, in which we've been discussing how NATO allies can work better with each other to maintain military capabilities in a time of reduced defence budgets. These meetings have been sparked by NATO's Smart Defence Initiative, and I'm grateful to NATO for their support for our meetings. Tomorrow, some of us are going to take part in a round table that will be able to look in a bit more detail at the topics we're discussing this evening. But for now, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Bernard Gray, who's Chief of Defence Materiel in the UK Ministry of Defence. Bernard is leading important reforms of how Britain procures and supports defence equipment, which even in these straitened times amounts to more than £6 billion a year. He was appointed by the present government after making a series of strong recommendations in a report that was commissioned by the previous government. And he's also had first-hand experience of the difficulties of cross-border cooperation, and no doubt he'll tell us if there have also been benefits. Bernard had a successful career in business before returning to the world of defence. In our former lives, we were actually colleagues at the Financial Times, and Bernard was then appointed Special Advisor to George Robertson as Secretary of State for Defence. Bernard will speak on the record, and he will then take questions to which the answers will also be on the record. Bernard.
Thanks, Alex. It's appropriate we should be sitting here as you were the person who stole my office, and we were sitting downstairs in Alex's new office, which looked remarkably like the office that we shared before. The reason that you can't tell the difference between the old office and the new office is that they are still, the desks of both are still covered in about 3 feet of paper. I was exchanging a joke with Alex in the lift on the way up. I said my way of rationalising the office when it fell due every quarter to try and do that was largely to shuffle the piles into roughly neat-looking piles rather than actually get rid of anything, because the volume of interesting research that you were just about to read never seemed to go down.
That's absolutely true.
And it's a great pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to everybody for coming. I think I can recognise most people in the audience. I want to start by thanking the International Institute for Strategic Studies for arranging this important meeting. From my perspective, the timing could not have been better, because how we, as defence customers and suppliers, meet our collective responsibility to provide the means by which nations remain secure from threats most effectively in the future really defines my role as Chief of Defence Materiel. And although the principles of international defence cooperation have traditionally had national governments as their focus, those that underpin the NATO smart defence principles of prioritisation, specialisation and cooperation, being aimed at collective security through the alliance, are in many ways equally applicable to the challenges that the defence industry faces and my own challenge in reforming defence acquisition and support. I am indeed struck by the common themes that underpin the problem and the solution in both the respective spheres of smart defence and its underpinning values of cooperative effort, and the Materiel strategy, which is the reform programme for the UK Defence Acquisition Organisation. Both programmes have their genesis in resource constraints which, as belts have tightened, have brought to light underlying capability shortfalls which already existed. Both recognise that to be effective and efficient, you need to eradicate waste and duplication, to stop doing those things that you're not best at, and to accept the help of others. It's simply true that you cannot do everything yourself. It requires us to be willing to change our approach and to persuade others to do so likewise. And in the UK, we are changing our approach. Across the Ministry of Defence, we are undergoing the widest and most far-reaching transformation programme that has ever been undertaken there. We have just published a fully funded, balanced, audited equipment plan, which provides for the first time the certainty, transparency and commitment that our industry needs. Within my own area of responsibility, I am addressing the challenges of change, encouraging not just an involvement by the private sector, but also other areas of the public sector, to help drive improvement. It's not just industry that benefits from a transparent and stable financial position in equipment planning. The clear commitment to those capabilities which are being funded also displays our commitment to what NATO can expect of us from the UK as our contribution to collective security. The UK's commitment to NATO is, I think, impressive. We are the second largest contributor to NATO operations with around 9,500 personnel. We provide a combined civilian and military budget of over £230 million towards NATO's operation. The UK personnel fill around 900 posts in the command and force structures, agencies and headquarters, and we are one of only 3 allies to meet the 2% of GDP defence spending target. Within NATO, too many countries are struggling to meet their financial responsibilities to the alliance, and so not managing to maintain appropriate and proportional capabilities as their contribution. And within Europe, arguably we have overcapacity and duplication in manufacturing at the same time. For example, Europe's armed forces have at least 7 types of military helicopter and 4 types of modern main battle tank. There are 3 types of fighter aircraft currently being manufactured in Europe, and at my count, something over 9 in service with European nations, before you start to count the North Americans. There are 11 suppliers of frigates and 4 suppliers of aircraft carriers, which is just an interesting number in my view. It's approximately equal to the number of aircraft carriers, I think, versus just 1 of each in the United States. And there are no fewer than 23 types of armoured vehicles which will be commissioned in Europe over the next 10 years, a situation that we have all been aware of for quite some time. And yet, despite this multiplicity of suppliers, as was demonstrated during the Libyan campaign, there are some critical capability shortfalls. So within NATO, we have experienced the symptoms, but we've also identified one possible treatment, smart defence, and we now need to persuade ourselves to actually take the medicine. We may have written the prescription, but it's yet to be clear that we are prepared to take it. Our collective challenge, then, is to maximise the capability we can squeeze out of the limited resources that we have. This is not a new conundrum, but it is one that's been brought into sharp relief in these times of harsh financial challenge. And as a possible response to this challenge, the history of equipment collaboration is, of course, both long and checkered. There have been notable successes, if one defines success as delivering, eventually, important and versatile capabilities. Lynx, Puma, Gazelle, Jaguar, Tornado, Typhoon, and more recently, the Storm Shadow missile are all examples of success by that measure. Indeed, for Storm Shadow, as I'm sure many of you will know, Storm Shadow represented a unique collaborative approach between Britain and France, where we agreed a joint requirement and asked a supplier, in this case MBDA, to provide the solution for both nations. A collective trust, therefore, between both nations and between customer and supplier was required in that case. Now, if I have one suggestion for you in your discussions at this conference, it would be that you consider why this approach has not been more successfully replicated more often. It is, after all, over 10 years since Storm Shadow was ordered. Many such collaborative programs have been bedeviled by delay, spiralling costs, and in some cases, complete abandonment by us or one or more other partner nations. Maybe this was the inevitable price of our initial attempts at collaboration in the past, but it will only have been an acceptable price if, in the paying, we have learned the lessons and risen to the challenges. Now, more than ever, this is a price we can no longer afford. The political challenges to delivering smart defence are considerable, but they must be faced. For governments, the change in mindset required to build the specialisation pillar in particular is the most difficult. Getting to nations to think in a more collegiate way and begin to adopt a more enlightened and flexible approach to capabilities considered as sovereign is a significant step. This is a particular challenge when we consider access to IPR across borders. And of course, the questions of jobs, technologies, industrial footprint, national agenda, and national sovereignty in deploying capabilities remain difficult issues. We must guard against the danger that smart defence is seen as the means by which nations reduce defence spending unduly. As I've already mentioned, fully funded and transparent equipment plans provide a counterweight against such temptation, and we do have critical shortfalls that we need to address in enhancing our capabilities, not maintaining them at the current level. There are challenges too in ensuring that smart defence is tied to NATO defence planning processes, and that as customers, nations demand common standards in defence equipment. Because the reality is that multinational operations still suffer from poor interoperability. We also need to be pragmatic. Bilateral groupings or ad hoc nodes of shared interest may offer the most realistic ways forward. But even such limited collaborations are often difficult. We have, for example, very good working relationships between the UK and France on a number of programmes, and in parentheses, it's an unfortunate statistical pattern that England have now beaten France in the Six Nations Championship 3 times since my appointment. I send my best wishes to Laurent. But we have, despite the trend in rugby, we have a good working relationship on a number of programmes. But I think that Laurent would agree with me that our collective progress has not been as swift as either of us would have wanted. Both of us want to do better, but progress has been difficult. And we should be better at this, because that most basic of principles, first outlined by the political philosopher Hobbes, of acting together in ceding a proportion of our rights to a common authority for the collective interest and security of all, is hardly new. We accept international rules and regulations across a wide range of everyday activities and in our business lives, and have helped establish such bodies as the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union on that basis. Indeed, as Hobbes pointed out, it is the foundation of the nation state. And with globalisation, more than ever before, civil society has to think and act in a global and interconnected manner too. In government, the integrated strategies we have for key countries are classic examples of what I might call smart power thinking. Within the UK, we are linking the work for the Department of International Development, the FCO, the Ministry of Defence, and our intelligence and security agencies with other organs of the state who deal with issues such as energy and exports to produce a framework of mutually supporting actions in each country and region. This is about drawing together all the instruments of national power so that the sum of British effort is much bigger than its component parts. And this is an approach generally generated domestically but implemented on the international stage, which we must use as our template for collective defence with our partner nations through the participation in our international defence and security alliances. In doing so, we must exhibit flexibility, another key tenet which applies equally to defence cooperation and acquisition reform. For recent events have taught us that if we are to make smart defence a success, then making NATO more flexible, encouraging collaboration amongst groups of members, including with partners outside the alliance, and which could have the effect of boosting the overall alliance capability, is key. We've already proved we can do this collectively. One such example is the enforcement of the no-fly over Libya in 2011. Sweden, a non-NATO nation, contributed 8 of its Gripen aircraft and a C-130 transport aircraft. This was the first time in over 60 years that Sweden had conducted an out-of-area operation with an offensive air component. Indeed, it was times when the Swedish Air Force provided something in the region of 40% of the entire coalition air picture, an extraordinary contribution. So there are many different ways of working together, and we should not be afraid to explore initiatives that add value to the capability of the alliance as a whole, even if not all alliance members are part of it. And of course, there are challenges for industry too. I have already alluded to some, but fundamentally, the question is this: does industry want to come to the table to help governments reduce costs by working together? Or, arguably as we see now, does industry feel that its own interests are best served by continuing to operate in various domestic markets in isolation? We need industry to be more efficient, effective, and as with governments and alliances, more flexible. It must look for common demand, seize opportunities to enhance its own capabilities, particularly in the service and support sector, and be open to new approaches. And we need increasing levels of innovation, both technically and in business processes, to meet threats within budgets. Part of this will require us, and, more importantly, the larger prime contractors, to encourage an expansion of involvement from the supply chain by small and medium-sized enterprises, which are inherently more agile. This is a particular challenge for us in defence, as I recognise, but it is one that we must meet. And I would also welcome, you should not be surprised to hear this, a more demanding set of suppliers. Industry needs to be more challenging of the customer and look to encourage joint or even complementary requirements. Recent operations in Libya and Afghanistan have taught us all a lot about collaboration and the concept of maximising each other's strengths and capabilities to the common good. It has also reinforced those lessons we have already learned, particularly on the importance of air superiority. And it is indeed in the air domain, partly in recognition of the high investment costs entailed in the provision of air power, that we have in the past seen the most fruitful examples of collaboration, and which may well offer the best opportunities in the future to benefit from smart defence, particularly in the areas of support and logistics. The A400M may yet be an example of where we might, collectively, gain efficiencies through the centralisation of support and developing a common solution, although admittedly we do appear to lack the appetite consistently to pursue such non-national solutions. The desire to protect jobs in each country and the ease and convenience of access to domestic resources by national air forces is a very strong pull. But perhaps at least there might be more of an opportunity to share such assets on operations. Indeed, post-2015 there are opportunities in the field of air-to-air refuelling, for example, where the UK anticipate having spare capacity in its A330 fleet of Voyager aircraft. This could be made available to other nations if contracting arrangements allow. The theme of your seminar is to consider how NATO and European Union states may maintain and enhance military capabilities during an era of defence cuts via cooperation and reform. As such, it's an examination of the rationale for private sector companies and governments to engage collectively with smart defence and pooling and sharing agendas. There is a quote attributed either to Harry Truman or Woody Allen, take your pick, that decisions are made by those who show up. As a call to arms to encourage a potentially apathetic or uninspired electorate to vote, it is a simple and effective message. Now, I'm not saying that any of us are apathetic when it comes to defence acquisition and reform, quite the opposite. But as a reminder that we must all be prepared to pitch in collectively and not leave decisions to others, it strikes an equally powerful note. Sometimes I think that we will the end, but not the means. And I've already outlined to you how I see such collective engagement already as we take forward work on the UK's Ministry of Defence acquisition and support functions, and I'll say a little more about this in a moment. Simply put, both governments and suppliers must rise to the challenge of this defence landscape. This will entail pursuing legitimate and transparent consultation with industry as part of creating a new defence framework. It's essential that we continue to share scarce skills and valuable experience, bringing private sector disciplines and productivity to public procurement and national assets. In doing so, governments will be tough but fair customers. We will seek to root out poor performance both within our own organisation and from our suppliers. For as the UK Secretary of State has mentioned previously, defence money is for creating defence capability, not for subsidising failure either in the Ministry of Defence or in industry. But the factor that we must consider now in creating this defence capability is to ensure that the whole of our collective capability is greater than the sum of the parts. Because individual nations are finding it harder, if not impossible, to afford for themselves all of the parts that they need, the focus on creating a larger whole must be pursued. I mentioned earlier the capability shortfalls that we experienced during the Libyan campaign. And remember that then this was a relatively small campaign. Under NATO definitions, it does not even qualify as a small joint operation. ISTAR would seem to be an area when, considering modernising their own air forces, those nations who may not desire or cannot afford to acquire expensive combat platforms might devote a greater proportion of their defence budget in an effort to acquire air ISTAR assets instead, specialising in capability for the generation of collective defence. And such cooperation is indeed not limited to equipment issues only. It should ideally comprise all aspects that will improve our collective capabilities: organisations, procedures, decision-making, processes, individual as well as collective professionalism, financial discipline, education, training, exercises, and logistics support. And in the reform of defence acquisition within the UK, which shares many of the facets that I have just listed, all of these components are part of the solution to the problems I've outlined here. We cannot continue to sustain our armed forces if we do not seize the opportunity to do something radical with our equipment programme. The materiel strategy, the reform of defence equipment and support within the UK's MOD, is how we see that reform progressing. And we have done some initial analysis, and we now need to make sure that our proposals are the right ones. We expect ministers to make decisions soon on the direction we will take in assessing these proposals. But for me, a solution which engages the private sector is more likely to deliver the most benefits than one which relies on the state alone. And we will test this proposition over the course of the next year. The aim of enhanced defence collaboration across alliances and within Europe, both politically and industrially, is not new. There have been past successes. There are aircraft and helicopters flying, engines powering naval vessels, and missiles ready for use, all the result of successful collaborative ventures. But the need to deliver further efficiencies in defence acquisition support and the provision of capability to those international security bodies to which we subscribe has never been more urgent. On the political side, there are many challenges to face. Each of us as nations must be altruistic, while international, EU pooling and sharing and NATO smart defence approaches must be complementary. And there are opportunities there for us collectively to grasp, particularly in the areas of equipment and logistics support. But we must ensure that collaboration arrangements are so structured as to provide the maximum protection from the temptation of individual national sovereignty to override the collective international benefit. For industry, the challenge, for once, is to keep pace with the drive for efficiency that is currently all-consuming in the management of defence acquisition. And by responding positively for our demands for a defence and security industry that is capability-driven, competent, innovative, and competitive, we will succeed. Many of the defence and security challenges and threats we are facing now, and will do so with more prevalence in the future, do not recognise organisational or national boundaries. They cannot be neatly packaged. They are not easily eradicated. They demand a sophisticated but determined response from us. And in doing so, it's our fundamental obligation to our citizens to get this right. We must be flexible, financially disciplined, and we must ensure that our collective sum is greater than the individual parts. To do this, we will need a collaborative and reformist approach. I wish you well in your discussions tomorrow. I look forward to hearing your conclusions. Thank you very much.
Bernard, thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much for highlighting some of the areas where there has indeed been successful cooperation, and also for mentioning areas for opportunities for the future. I think you've also questioned the will of some of the parties involved to really get stuck into cooperation, and I think that needs to be addressed. And you've also mentioned how Britain's own reforms that you're involved in could contribute to that. I'm going to open it straight up to questions. If I call on you, please do identify who you are and where you come from. Who would like to kick it off? Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. That was a very interesting exposition. You asked a question, I think it was rhetorical, about why hasn't the success of MBDA been repeated? But of course, MBDA is structured so that you have an industrial interest representing the two key players in the procurement of missiles, and also including the Germans. Is it therefore a little bit too late to think in terms of equal rationalisation and restructuring across the board in European defence industries?
It was rhetorical, you're right. I think that the consolidation of the defence industry is a potentially helpful component in that regard. Of course, it can have, like anything, it's not an unalloyed good, and the concentration and reduction in choice can lead to greater monopolistic practices if one is not careful. But it's really at the requirements end that I think that the problem lies. I'm struck by the fact that in the ground vehicle sector, for example, as I pointed out, there are 20-odd programs planned in the next 10 years. If I address any particular area of the ground environment, I am frequently, by which I mean universally, told that there is no extant solution to X or Y vehicle problem. Something which I frankly just don't believe. But the approach, often of the requirement setters to the requirement that they are setting is very similar to that between the dog and the lamppost. And people wish to have their own requirement and almost sometimes deliberately differentiate it in order to make it such that they can't take somebody else's. And I think that challenge is the one that we must overcome. I'm not sure that requirement setters really understand how much cost they are driving in the system by differentiating things in order to make it unique and therefore a national solution. And industry probably could do more to point out to people what the costs of uniqueness really are. Let's go at the back with the camera.
Yep, right at the back there, thank you.
Thanks. Christian Möring, German Institute for International Affairs. I have one question, just to explore the reach that you could imagine. If the problems British industry and government have with the Warrior and the Scout program, and you can't fix it for the next 5 years or the next 5 months, I don't know, could you imagine to buy German Pumas and German Boxers instead?
I'm not sure I understand the question, if you forgive me.
I was talking about the continued, as far as I know, the continued problems of the British refurbishment programs of your armored infantry fighting vehicles, Scout and Warriors, which, as far as I know, quite a lot of money has been spent, but no solution is on the table for the moment. The question is, could you imagine to go for off-the-shelf solutions?
Well, now that I do understand the question, I don't agree with its premise. There are two separate programs here, one of which, as you say, Warrior, is a refurbishment program. Although to describe it simply as a refurbishment program is probably underselling it, because as well as having a completely new turret, it has a much larger 40mm cannon being fitted, which is a very significant change. And the other vehicle program is not a refurbishment, it's a new vehicle program in the shape of Scout. Both are on contract, and the Scout vehicle is being developed and the Warrior vehicle is being refurbished. So for those applications where we have let contracts for the heavier end of armour fighting vehicles already, that's done, I don't see any point in revisiting history. My point is more in relation to future vehicle procurements on areas such as general utility vehicles, which might be 8-wheeled rather than tracked, for example. And that's a requirement which we have not yet specified in detail and not yet gone through a procurement exercise on. And when I look at that, I would be somewhat surprised if there weren't people somewhere in the world who wanted to move sections of troops around across mixed terrain in some safety. It seems to me a reasonably fundamental aspect of land warfare that you would want to do that. And so I'm a little bit surprised that people tell me that no such vehicle exists. But I'm equally sure that if I went to any other European national capital, I would get exactly the same response. And the real point behind this is not whether there are difficulties in any one individual procurement or not, but what will exists to genuinely share a baseline requirement that allows people to drive forward economic value versus the wish to have indigenous national solutions everywhere. And the UK certainly has exhibited this tendency in the past, but so I would argue has every other European nation, and indeed North American nation come to that. And that's the real challenge for us. Looking at the programs of the future, what are we prepared to do to pool and share when it really comes to it?
Yeah. Near the back also.
Thank you, Chairman. Gordon Wilson, Fellow of the Royal United Service Institute and a member here. Could I trouble you on the shipbuilding programme where we're reaching a state now, I think, where looking ahead, the resources of BAE systems will have to be run down before we come to replacement ships like perhaps the Type 26 or maybe even a smaller corvette programme where such a thing to be approved. How do we stop this thing? Can we not put some orders in that can actually keep the shipbuilding capability before it's run down again and then have to be rebuilt at an enormous cost? That's happened with the submarine service and rebuilding the acute class submarines. Just that sort of thing happened, which is a hugely expensive way and very wasteful way of doing business.
Again, I'm not sure that I would agree with the premise of the question. At the moment, the shipbuilding programme within the UK is at a multi-decade high. It's literally true that we have never built two 65,000-ton ships for the Royal Navy until the last 5 years. And it's not quite true, but almost true, that every piece of hard standing in the UK has been pressed into service to manufacture some piece or other of the aircraft carriers. So that there is some relativity to consider here about what the appropriate size for the shipbuilding industry is going to be for a sustainable long-term future. Because however desirable it may be, we cannot simply manufacture more aircraft carriers in order to keep the shipbuilding industry at its current capacity. We have a programme which, as you have sort of indicated, includes the Type 26 programme, and we are working with the industry to make sure that we have a smooth transition between the aircraft carriers and Type 26. There will be a level of shipbuilding, naval military shipbuilding capacity that we can sustain within the UK, and our aim, of course, is not to form some gap where nothing happens, but our aim is to get a successful transition from the aircraft carriers into Type 26, and we will see whether we're able to do that with the industry in an effective manner.
Thanks. A gentleman there in the fourth row.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned the issue of differing requirements for example, armored personnel carriers, which seemingly is more or less the same thing, it's more or less the same place where they will be operating. But nevertheless, different countries come up with very different requirements. But it seems to me like this is not an economic issue, it's more a political issue, since these decisions are taken in capitals. How do you envisage using the international level, using fora like the European Union, like NATO, to deal with this issue of very differing requirements?
Well, of course, I think it's actually a political, economic and military issue, which makes it a particularly tight knot, I think, is the truth of it. Requirement setters are by and large military. And whilst governments will have a view about how those requirements might be fulfilled, the person usually specifying an armoured fighting vehicle will be a soldier or a group of soldiers. And and of course there are, I should point out, legitimate differences in ground doctrine that may lead to differences in the way that people fight and therefore what they need. But I don't think that's sufficient to explain current circumstances. But nonetheless, in a natural human way, people want to design their own thing. And they've had the luxury of doing so. And in some senses, they are abetted in that activity by the desire by governments to have national programs which place work within their own country. So there is an alliance, in a sense, between the political and the military in generating the issue. The reason I say it's also economic is the fact that, and I quite often run into this problem with requirement setters, is there is not an understanding that there is a finite amount of money available. And therefore a choice to spend money on one thing is a choice not to spend it on something else. People will make very local and narrow decisions, not just national decisions, but decisions within armed vehicle fleets about pursuing their local objective, which may run counter to the economic good of the whole. It is this Hobbesian problem. And I think the first thing to do in trying to counter that is to expose for people the full economic cost of that behaviour. Because unless people understand what it's actually costing you to do that, they won't bother to tackle it. And most people do not realise either how much national uniqueness costs, or indeed how much changing your mind mid-production also costs. So to my mind, the first way of approaching this topic, and I will confess to having had in the past some difficulty with this myself, of persuading people that changing your mind all of the time costs you money. And people insist to me, and have insisted to me, that it doesn't, which I find interesting, if implausible. And so we really need to cross quite a significant bridge here in helping people understand what the real underlying cost of this is, and do they want to take the limited defence resources that are available to them and spend it on that ghettoisation into small vehicle fleets of different requirements? Do they actually want to generate some commonality which gives greater collective defence? So it is, the economics will, if anything is going to drive this, the economics will. There will not be enough political weight in the absence of economic pressure to generate collective desire, I think.
Nick Childs, here in the third row, thank you.
Thank you. Nick Childs from the BBC. Sir Bernard, you mentioned the Anglo-French relationship. France has its white paper coming up. I wondered if you'd considered what the potential impact on prospective Anglo-French programme cooperation might be out of this, and indeed what impact it might have on smart defence. It looks likely that there will be a continuing drumbeat of major national adjustments and readjustments going on. Don't these represent a huge further challenge to integrating smart defence, even as they appear to provide the theoretical rationale for going forward?
Yeah. I think they do. Sadly, it's very sweet of you, but I'm playing Mr. Gray. They do represent a difficulty. And indeed, part of the difficulty, to be specific, that Laurent and I have had in integrating our work is that for approximately the first 12 months that I was in post, we were in bulk in the UK about commitments to equipment programs. Having got to a position in spring of 2012 where we have settled our equipment program down, balanced it and funded those elements we wished to pursue, almost immediately after that, certainly within 3 or 4 months, the French went into their election cycle and then into their white paper. And so there was a sort of glorious window of about 3 months where Laurent and I could both commit. And that is a problem because, quite naturally and understandably, the French will want to take their time to get their defence review right. And of course, that will take us further into this year, by which time we start to head towards the next UK election. It's not just the UK and France, however. There are other issues where, for example, Germany will not be able to make decisions from about now through to around Christmas because of their election cycle. So in other areas, for example, it impacts as well. I think it is a genuine problem, and I don't have a particularly good answer to it. I think the two things I would press around this issue are, the first one is that you will not actually get significant cooperation unless it's in the context of programs. So quite a few people came to me a couple of years ago and said, well, it's all changed now, Bernard, and you're rather old-fashioned about these things, and we don't need new programs to be able to rationalise or cohere. But I fear that's not really true. My experience of the last couple of years says that actually new programs are the focal point for bringing industry together. And there is more that we can do on industrial rationalisation if people choose to. And that, of course, of itself is difficult because people want to maintain the maximum industrial footprint. So I think that in those windows that do exist, and with the work that goes on despite the political purdah that happens around Europe, that we have to try to find those programs, linchpin programs, that we can hang together and push on. And if there's a silver lining in it, I think some of the areas where we are weaker are some of the areas which are potentially susceptible to earlier amelioration. So if I think about software-related things, we're not, at least if you're as old as me, we tend to think in terms of platforms most of the time. But of course, increasingly we're in a world of systems and integrations of systems. And if we think about areas like iStar and the supportive enabling assets and the use of civilian airframes for deployment of military purposes, those potentially offer areas for us to bring together systems to improve those enablers which the European part of NATO has been particularly weak on in the past, and potentially to improve interoperability by having common standards set within them. So I think some focus on iStar would be good. I think it is also, if you look at the extant programs, it is the case that there is the potential to rationalise the support arrangement for those. Over the last decade, the UK has done a lot to improve the efficiency of the support arrangements it has around the Tornado aircraft, for example, by in the kind of industrial to military collaboration that I've been talking about. If you're ever fortunate enough to go to RAF Marham, you'll see very close integration in the teams there, and it has taken a lot of cost out of the system. That could go further on a transnational basis, I think, without significantly interfering with actual sovereignty. It's a question, and the good part is that there is significant money in support. Alex mentioned the money we're spending on new acquisition, but we spend an equal amount on supporting existing equipment. And we can drive support spend in to try to rationalise some of those costs transnationally where we've got air platforms in a way that we don't at the moment. So there are some ways through, but it really it requires you, I think, to be specific and fairly determined to pull this together.
Thanks. Ben Barry, towards the back, please.
I'm the ISS expert on land warfare. I look at armies and their equipment worldwide. Can I speak up in favour of requirement setters and look at it from a different perspective?
By all means, have you got any money?
I am a taxpayer, and I hope you're spending mine wisely. But no, seriously, I think requirement setters sometimes get it right. Let me take a British example. The Centurion tank, fantastic export success story. Germany, the Leopard 1 and Leopard 2, exactly the same. And you could argue that you're seeing a breaking wave with the BAE CV-90. So a British example, a German example, and actually a Swedish example. Now, what is it that has made those equipments sell so well and also achieve a degree of smart defence, pooling and sharing, particularly on support and training, which they did. I'd say in those cases, you've got a magic moment where a requirement setter gets it right, and industry produces something that's a bloody good piece of equipment, is flexible, agile, and adaptable, but also offers excellent bang for the buck. And all three examples of those achieved fantastic export sales without the aid of the US FMS program.
If only we had bought them.
Well, we did buy the Centurion.
No, if only we had bought the Leopard. I would agree with your point.
Well, my point is not advocating that the British buy the Leopard, or indeed the Puma or the Boxer or the CV90, but my point is requirement setters can get it right, and when industry gets it right as well, you get the planets in the right alignment, you also get effective outcome of smart defence. So what from your point of view is the special magic that makes it work? And if, in a sense, why aren't we emphasising the positive on that side?
Well, I mean, in one sense, I can't agree with you more. It's just that we haven't done that. My point about us not buying the Leopard is, if Britain and France had bought the Leopard tank and we had a common Western European standard for what is, as you say, a very, very good design, we would be a lot better off than we are now. But we didn't. We designed and built something else, and France designed and built something else. And those three decisions together, one of which was correct and the other two were wrong, have cost us a lot of money. Okay, so yeah, I'm not saying that requirement setters can't get it right. I just wish that they would be prepared to accept that other requirement setters sometimes got it righter than them. We need people to set requirements, absolutely. But, I think it was an opaque issue for all of us when the UK decided that it wanted a rifled tank barrel when the rest of NATO wanted a smoothbore tank barrel 20 years ago. A decision which is only rummer in retrospect by the consideration that the Army gives to, if we were to upgrade the Challenger 2 tank, we would replace its current rifled barrel with a smoothbore barrel. I'm looking at this thinking, my point is not that requirement setters get it wrong, but that requirement setters need to come together in the common interest and recognise other people's good work. The Germans did a tremendous job on the Leopard. I wish we owned it.
Great, thanks. I think there's a lady right at the back. Am I correct? Yes.
Thanks. Good evening. Victoria Smith from BFBS. My question is, how do you visualise procurement for the battles of the future when in recent years everything's been so focused on Afghanistan and the front line there, when we don't know what's still to come? How do you visualise that procurement, and how would the current programme of the aircraft carriers building fit into your visualisation of the future for procurement?
As with the previous exchange about requirement setters, I'm in the happy position of just ordering whatever they tell me to. And you want a pink one or you want a blue one, that's fine with me. And so it's not really my role, it is, in this case, Air Marshal Hillier's role to decide what that battle space looks like and how it should be populated, and I'm always a bit loath to tread onto his territory. But to offer a few sort of general observations about it, flexibility is going to be important. So I think it's a fairly universal truth that the equipment with which an armed force turns up at the beginning of a campaign is not the equipment that's decisive in the end of it. And so we need to be able to adapt. And that has also been our experience in Afghanistan, for example, where the Ministry of Defence in the UK has bought over 2,000 vehicles for that campaign. There are debates that go on issues about large-scale formations versus asymmetric warfare, and probably there will be some of both, rather irritatingly from our point of view, since it's most expensive to equip against both. But ground warfare will continue to be a significant component, and we will need to both fight in proper formation, as it were, but also in small irregular units. There is clearly going to be a dramatic increase in the use of I-STAR assets, surveillance, target acquisition. it's probably not as clear to the general general population as it might be quite how much the nature of that warfare has changed in the last 15 years. And quite how that is, we can see some of the outputs of that. You have all of the arguments about the moral efficacy or otherwise of drone strikes, for example. But you see the reverse side of it in campaigns like Libya, where extraordinary efforts were made to avoid collateral civilian casualties. And they were able to be made because of the nature of the I-STAR assets and the guided weapons themselves which were in use. And by any standards, if you look at the battle damage assessments from that, it was the most precision campaign of any campaign in history. And I think it is only beginning to sink into people what that means for, if I dare I may say it, armoured fighting vehicle manufacturers, when the levels of precision and the levels of oversight from the air are as telling as they are. Beyond that, of course, there is the fashionable area of cyber, and I think that is an area of great significance, because there is partly the potential theft of important intellectual property, operational secrets and so forth, but there is also the issue of how you might, should you choose to try to deploy it, seek to destabilize the state. In making the banking system, we've all seen the impact, I think, of what happens to an unstable banking system, and it's an experience I don't suppose we'd all rush to repeat. And so therefore making sure that the banking system is resilient to attacks on it which attempt to shut it down would be absolutely vital. If you just thought about generating uncertainty in people's minds about how much money was or was not in their bank accounts and whether there was or was not a run going on in a bank, how much chaos you can create with that, bringing the banking system into gridlock would be significant, as well as already hardened national assets. So I think those areas of I-STAR, C2, and cyber resilience are going to be extremely important in the future, as will precision weaponry. I find it hard to imagine we will go back to a time of using any significant amounts of non-precision weapons in a mixed environment.
Thanks. Michael, did you have Michael McLean?
Michael McLean, I'm Chosen Associates. You said you were seeking a solution that engaged the private sector in procurement.
Yes.
Direct procurement, and how far you will be able, I think the jargon is the go-to, to use private sector procedures and private sector players. It's, of course, theoretically a great idea that politicians will always like and officials will sort of go along with. As you develop the process, it becomes a little more complicated. The loss of control begins to count against you. Has this been the dynamic of the discussions of this question so far? Can you give any sort of preview of how it's likely to come out? If not this time, will it ever happen? Presumably you looked internationally at the way anyone else was doing it, and did you find any models that were of any use to you, or is yours a pretty original process?
I think that there are not that many examples in the defence sphere, but what we're really talking about here is capital programs. So if you look at capital equipment programs rather than, if you think about it as capital equipment programs rather than defence, there are rather more models of success. And one I would immediately point to is London 2012, for example, where you had the controlling organisation was a fusion between public servants and private bodies, which were not just delivering the venues, but actually managing the programme. And despite predictions to the contrary, it was a great success, and came in within, albeit its rather significantly well-provided budget. So I think there are examples of success where this operates, and within defence itself, that particular entity was a hybrid, but within defence itself we have had the Atomic Weapons Establishment operating as a GOCO for the last 20 years. And of course, people who don't like something try to turn around and argue that it's different because. And so some people say that the AWE is a different example to defence procurement. I slightly fail to see the difference myself. The idea that people argue that said that the United States might not like it, seems strange when our nuclear cooperation with the United States is reasonably extensive. So I think there are examples of where it works, and there are many beyond that, but there's just a couple in the UK. There are international examples as well. The US nuclear system has basically been operated on a government-owned, contractor-operated basis since 1942, and appears to have been a reasonably successful effort in that direction. But would I say that what you describe has been my experience? I would say no on both counts. It has not been an idea that politicians have grasped at, nor one that officials have sought to avoid. It's been a process of taking people through what might seem like a counterintuitive solution by defining what it is we're trying to do, what the problems with that are, what the potential solutions to those problems are, and amongst the array of those, what will deliver significant and lasting change. I've given this example elsewhere, but it took me 12 months to recruit a finance director for my organisation. In that time, I spent 1 month in the marketplace looking for him, as it turned out it was him, and the rest of the time was absorbed in exciting Whitehall bureaucracy. It seems to me that given that money is quite an important component of being able to run an equipment program successfully, that wasn't the best division of time between the two sets of tasks. And I use it sometimes. It would be true equally well of recruiting any of my senior management team. If I need to go outside for any skill, it takes between 9 and 12 months. And that's just not, and by the way, of course, I can't pay a market rate for people, so I have to go out and find those people who want to do this for some different reason, who have those capabilities at the moment. I don't think that that's an effective way of going around recruiting for a 17,000 person organisation. And while we're on that subject, I think one of the things that people miss about this is that Defence Equipment and Support is a very different organisation to the rest of the Ministry of Defence and Whitehall. Whitehall is populated by policy specialists, by and large. And if you want to be a policy specialist, then Whitehall is one of the best places to work. You have good pay and rations, you have decent pension provision, you have significant influence where your policies are significantly likely to be turned into reality. So for those who want to be policy professionals, Whitehall is a strong attractor. And the alternative employment options are not huge. There is academia, there are think tanks and so on, but it's not a huge hinterland from which to draw. If you look at the kind of people that are employed in my organisation, though, they are very different. They are engineers, they are project managers, they are finance professionals. And those kind of people are in high demand in private industry. There are half a dozen employers in the private sector around the Bristol Ring Road, before I actually get outside of town, who are competing for the same people that we need. So, and the mismatch in what we pay versus what they pay is depends on the grade, but it's of the order of 40%. And I am currently experiencing a leaching of talent from my organisation to those organisations, because people in their mid-30s with families and mortgages and careers to manage cannot afford to subsidise the state to the tune of 40% of income. Particularly, I'm losing 2 1-stars at the moment, both of whom had spouses who earn significant amounts of money. They have children, they stop for a period of time in order to raise their children. That's a drain on household income. They can't afford to work for the state anymore. So we are competing for a different pool of talent, and we are fundamentally disadvantaged in doing so. And we also employ an employment model which are last seen in the private sector in the banks in about 1975, where we recruit people at 21 and we attempt to hand them a gold watch at 60-something. Okay? Now, nobody does that anymore, except us. And if you do get people coming in from the outside, and I'm excluding myself specifically from this as a dangerous change agent, as it were, but if you bring other people in from the outside, the system doesn't recognise them. It regards them as being temporary, not of this cloth. So all of these are reasons why we need to move to a different model. We are not able to attract, retain, motivate, promote the people that we need in order to get these jobs done. And if you say, if we're in a serious contract negotiation, would you rather be up against the person paid 40% more or the person paid 50% less, whatever it works out in reverse? Who is more likely, statistically speaking, to get the better end of that contract? And why is it in the national interest for us to pay people less to negotiate against the industry? It's not clear to me that it is. Especially since the total operating costs of D&S are 8% of the money we spend. So I think there are reasons to think that there are significant changes required. And my point about this is not that it's some set-piece Sir Humphrey issue. It's actually that you have to walk through quite a complicated set of factors before you realise that you have to do something quite serious in order to be able to overcome these problems. And so the model, to come to your point, Mike, is to say, we're thinking about running a model that says, okay, what's the best that the state sector can do by way of freedoms, delegations, authorities, and so forth, and what might the private sector offer us? And because I'm a person that believes in competition, let's try and run those two things against one another and see what's the best that the private sector can do, what's the best that the public sector can do, and then let's pick. And that's how I would like to approach this problem.
Thanks for that answer, Bernard. The gentleman there on the fourth row, and then we'll take you over there, and then that will be the last question. Thanks.
Matthew Saville, MOD. At the risk of posing another question where you're going to disagree with the premise, what your...
There's a name for that kind of stuff, isn't there? I forget what it is.
The sort of change you're proposing, where you're potentially asking nations to give up or diminish sovereign capability and industry to probably shrink, will require significant political will. And yet looking at diminishing defence budgets, problems with interoperability, reluctance to deploy, you could argue that political will is in pretty short supply. So having laid out the sort of glorious vision of the future, how do you actually achieve that? How do you drive that through, other than through the power of logic, which seems to have a fairly tenuous relationship with defence acquisition up until now in Europe?
No, I wouldn't disagree with the question, actually. And I'm not trying to say that, I'm not trying to some sort of Panglossian thing that says, oh, well, just become more realistic about this. It really, I think all I'm saying is that if not a moment of truth, a vice of truth is with us that is steadily squeezing us. And we can spend our time, you'll be debating it in the next 24 hours, I'm sure, but we can spend our time spending more and more of scarce resources on unproductive overhead, which is fundamentally what this is about. Maintaining industrial capacity that we have no work for, maintaining multiplicities of design when there's clear winners, supporting national solutions to existing aircraft, for example, where rationalising Tornado aircraft would be an interesting example. That aircraft has been in service for a long time. What national capability is really protected by continuing to support it in multiple locations? And their overhead costs are associated with that. So unless we make a choice to say, I wish to have less overhead and more output, then we will not make the change. I've indicated that one of the ways of doing that is to help people understand quite how much money, both in absolute amounts and in percentage of defence outputs, goes in unproductive overhead. And of course it's also the truth that as you shrink the size of armed forces, the proportion devoted to overheads, generally speaking, goes up. Now, it may be that Europe actually decides that it's fine, thanks, and it chooses, in the end, graceful decline. It says it's, the priorities for us are the maintenance of national outputs, or the luxuriousness of apparent choice of having national producers or having our own thing, whatever it might be. That's a choice that they may make. All I'm trying to do here is to try and elucidate. I am not, by the way, a believer that economic force alone will deliver this output. Okay, so you can point to the force that is the economic driver, but if people's priorities still are national autarky, then that's what they'll get. And we just have to make a choice about which of those things we want. And all I'm trying to do is expose the nature of the choice rather than say that it will naturally come about, because I don't think it will unless people change what they're doing.
And the final question from Robert Wall over here. Thank you.
Bloomberg News. I just wanted to take you back briefly to the shipbuilding question, since this has been something that's been going on for some time. Now that the equipment budget is out, the 10-year plan, and the balanced budget, I guess I'm wondering how much more scope is there for you to, as you say, smooth things out? I mean, haven't we gone beyond that point, and are we not at the point where essentially a tough decision needs to be made, or do you still see potential in the program for flexibility to keep 3 yards open?
Well, I didn't really think I commented on the number of yards. What I'm commenting on is the fact that there is a very high level of activity going on at the moment, that there is a stable but lower level of activity in the future, and that we have to navigate between A and B. And actually there are a significant number of choices about exactly how you do that, and a lot of detailed work. So that's the process that's going on. So it's not the case that if you balance the budget overall, there is nothing that you can do to figure out how, within that, the work that you have is timed, for example. So there's a variety of choices about it.
Well, Bernard, you and I may have disorganized desks, but I think you've shown that...
I have to put it all away now.
That's right. No, you've shown that you're really able to organize your thoughts about all these issues very carefully, and I really want to thank you for giving such thoughtful answers to all the questions that have been put. I think we've really got an insight into your thinking on all this. Thank you all for coming, and let's thank Bernard for his very interesting remarks this evening.